Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. This is the next in our regular series of webinars with our sponsors, this time with Kingsley Napley. I'm Sarah Turner. For anyone I haven't met before, I'm the co-founder with Simon Hopkins of Angel Academy. As usual, to talk to us and ask questions, please use chat. Before we get going with our lovely panel, just a little bit about us. So Angel Academy exists to close the gender gap in startup investment, both the lack of investment going to female founders and the low number of women angel investing. We've been doing this since 2014, so we are very much the first kids on the block. Our focus is on scalable and innovative businesses, so in tech and science-based areas. And businesses addressing big global opportunities. We've reviewed many thousands of pitches over the years, and we're about to complete investment in our 49th female-founded tech startup, and we hope to make it 50 by the end of the year. So do we still need to talk about gender? Very sadly, yes. Investment into female founders lags far behind female entrepreneurship. So 87% of funding raised in Europe still goes to all male teams. If you're a female founder and have a male co-founder, who's usually the CEO, you'll have 12% of the available funding available for you. But if you're a sole female founder or part of a women-only founding team, you're playing for just 1% of all investment dollars. Women are equally underrepresented on the buy side as well. So despite the fact that we own half the wealth in the UK, only 14% of us participate as angel investors, and only 7% of us have invested in 10 or more businesses. And we invest less and less often also. The UK mean or typical ticket size per angel per deal is £33,000, and 135,000 is typically invested per year in 4 investments over the course of a year. And lastly, in European venture capital, so in institutional money, men still control 91% of all the funds. So Angel Academy, we're very focused on action, not words, putting our money where our mouths are. So our angel investors, and that includes Simon and I, have invested in 48 deals with Angel Academy so far and helped mobilize well over 150 million in co-investment. This could be from family offices, other angel networks, and VC funds. The companies we've backed employ going on for 1,000 people in high quality jobs, and many of them are scaling very quickly. While our focus is on gender equality, many of our portfolio are also addressing the UN's other sustainable development goals. And we're really proud to be on Bohurst's lists of most active angel networks. We're the only female focused network in their ranking. So what are we looking for in the investments that we do? Team is absolutely crucial at early stage. Do they have the right mix of experience, ability to execute, ability to sell and inspire? It's really the main thing we have to go on with these businesses at early or even pre-revenue stage. So we spend quite a lot of time getting to know the founders before we invest. Are they addressing a big market? And is the timing right for disruption now? Is it a problem that people actually pay to solve? Do they or will they have a moat? This doesn't usually mean they've got patents filed. Startups aren't typically in a position to be able to do that, but do they have something that others can't easily replicate or gives them a competitive advantage and possibly might be patentable in the future? We look at the traction they've achieved so far and the quality of that traction for early signs of product market fit. And we're looking, of course, for scalability and exit potential in the not too distant future. So we're very lucky at Angel Academy to have some great sponsors supporting us with their professional expertise. They advise us and the founders we back on hiring, deal terms, next stage investment, and tax and accountancy matters. But for now, back to today's fun. I'm delighted to invite onto the stage my panel for this evening. It's Mei Chung from Kingsley Napley, Ros Singleton, who's one of our angel investors, and Alex Hirsch, who's another angel investor with us. I've got a few questions to kick off the conversation, but we have plenty of time this afternoon for your questions, so please put them in chat as we go along. Okay, so perhaps starting with May, if we could ask members of the panel just to quickly introduce themselves, say who you are and what it is you do.
So hi everyone, I'm May. I'm an associate in the corporate team here at Kingsley Napley. We're basically a full service law firm, but I have a particular focus on early stage investments. So it's for companies receiving investment and angel investors and kind of family offices making investment. And we tend to work with our clients throughout the whole transaction process. So from negotiating term sheets through to assisting with due diligence and resolving the issues coming out of that, to negotiating investment documents and completing investment, all while keeping in mind future planning and growth. We have supported and sponsored Angel Academy since its inception about 9 years ago. So we're basically your legal point of call. Any legal questions, feel free to get in touch.
Thank you. Do you want to go next, Ros?
Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, my name's Ros Singleton. For those of you that don't know me, I do a few things. I've been working with Angel Academy and investing with them since about 2016. I'm a non-exec on a London Stock Exchange listed business called Alpha Wave, which is it's basically a silicon IP and custom silicon business. So, you know, microchips and that sort of stuff. I'm also a board observer on a business listed in the Toronto Stock Exchange called Lumen, which is a software, a global software buyer and runner, basically, specifically in the telecom space. I've been working in telecoms for about 30 years, and until the end of September, I was an executive director and the CEO of a fibre to the premise startup called Spring Fibre. And I've previously run a business called UK Broadband, where I reported to a board.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ros. And Alex, over to you.
Hi, I'm Alex Hirsch. I come from the institutional investment side, and I've always stuck to the very involved investment style. So where we have good access to the management, where we can get involved and provide them with our expertise and sometimes critical thinking, ideally. I've been with Angel Academy similar amount of times as Ros. It's been very exciting, and I see those huge numbers and it's fantastic that we had the opportunity to speak to all those companies. And I have invested in a few of them over the years. The reason why I'm here is one of the companies, Scale XP, gave me the opportunity to join the board as the investor director, where, well, we get into that, but where I'm very happy to join the journey.
Thank you, Alex. Right. Okay. So first question, sort of starting with some basics, and perhaps go to Ros and then Alex. What is a director?
There's quite a wide definition for directors. Basically, any person occupying the position of director, whatever they're called. So they could be those appointed by the company, they could be those appointed by the directors as temporary placements on the board. They also cover things like de facto directors, so those who have assumed responsibility, and kind of shadow directors. But as Ros and Alex mentioned, there's kind of non-execs and execs as well. So there's all kind of different names that you call directors, isn't there?
Okay, all right. I think that will all kind of come out in the conversation. But Ros, what's the purpose of a director?
Well, for me, there are a number of purposes, and there is a little bit of a difference between a non-exec and an exec director. I mean, the key thing is, you know, from a company's house perspective and a shareholder's perspective, and even, you know, if you work in charities or cooperatives, the basic point is that you're supposed to be holding the management to account and conducting, you know, a sort of arm's length, if you like, critical friend process that that looks after the business, and you are supposed to look after the interests of the business and the stakeholders in it, very importantly, all the stakeholders, not just, for example, the shareholders or just the employees. So in theory, it is supposed to give a sort of more rounded view. And clearly, you know, as Alex was saying, he's an investor director. Certainly some of the boards I've been on have investor directors. When you're on a listed business as a non-exec, a very big part of your responsibility is to try and represent the non-executive stakeholders, if you like, so the shareholders, and make sure the teams of the businesses are represented as well.
So, and just to bring sort of May in here on the, you know, some companies have advisory boards rather than formal boards. Are there any kind of legal differences there? What's the implication of that?
Yeah, so advisory boards are effectively kind of sounding boards, and they give directors insight. They are people that directors can get advice from, or kind of people that they can explore opportunities with. Advisors don't really have decision-making powers. Those are for directors, but they kind of provide knowledge and critical thinking and analysis to kind of increase the confidence of those making the decisions. So that's kind of the difference between directors and advisors.
Okay, did you have anything to add, Alex or Ros, on that definition?
Yeah, it's on the startup level, it's obviously all a bit more fluid. I mean, the legal obligations are always there, but when we see ourselves as also to an extent as a resource to the company, because they are very small teams, they're very stretched. They are welcoming the additional input, the additional expertise that is coming in. So it is not unlikely that even an NED finds him or herself in an advisory role. But that is not the original idea. Obviously, we at Angel Academy, we're trying to bring as many people with relevant experience to the table, and then the closer they get involved, that it's that they can add value to the business along the way. So I would say, for as long as the company is still at the fledgling level, the line is not always as clear as it would be for listed companies, for example.
Okay, so technically it's not an executive role, but often it's a little bit more fluid in startup situations. But you know, when you come to bigger boards, Ros, and there is a much clearer delineation, I would have thought.
I would say that there needs to be as well, because, you know, again, it's partly for that accountability, and you know, if you have a business that is running, you largely don't want to get in the way of the execs, but equally, you know, it's not unheard of that your opinion, your advice, your thoughts about, you know, for example, geopolitics, you know, particularly hot topic at the moment, and those sorts of things are, you know, is often, particularly if you have you know, certain connections and those sorts of things might be valued, because it's not necessarily something a business would have full time. You know, equally, you know, it's not advisory, if you like, but I suppose the advice comes with also a responsibility to review the P&L and those sorts of things. Again, it's not 100 miles away, I think, from a startup. I think just perhaps a level of detail that you go into is where the difference is, and perhaps sometimes the amount of time needed is probably broadly similar, but for slightly different reasons.
And just if you could, sort of staying with you, Ros, just touch on observers. What's that? Well,
so that, I think that depends on the board, really. So I've been on boards where a board observer position is one where it's almost like a training / stand-in place where somebody can sit there and learn by watching the board, for example, and participate where they need to, or where there's a particular area of expertise they have, but largely they don't get to vote, importantly, and the voting thing, you know, when push comes to shove, in the same way that when a supplier relationship goes a bit bad, you fall back to the contract, there may be times in a board's life cycle where you need to fall back to the paperwork and have a formal vote, you know, based on whatever the voting rights happen to be in the paperwork. And so, for example, they definitely wouldn't have a vote there. They don't have any decision-making power or veto power, generally, those sorts of things. Certainly the board I'm an observer on is one where I behave probably less like an observer than is traditional. However, I don't get to vote because of various legal stuff in Canada, basically. Slightly different here.
And I suppose from an investing point of view, you might want to have an observer on the board just for a little bit of visibility of what's going on there, even if you don't have any voting rights. So we quite often see observers on our startup boards as well.
And I think you know, again, it's valuable because it's a way of having more expertise, but without giving up control. And obviously, for a lot of founders, you know, they've been used to having control of their businesses, and you know, control between however many of them there are. And then all of a sudden, you've got not only other investors, but you've got other people turning up, expecting you to have board meetings, present them with a load of information, tell them why you've made them decisions, those sorts of things. So sometimes as well, particularly if you have a number of investors who've taken a proportion of the company, it can be an easier way, if you like, to add those on and try and deal with things. Even when you have one investor director, like Alex, for example, you could back up with some observers from some of the other investors.
Okay, thank you. And just moving on to May, director's duties. Obviously, you know, if you're an NED, it's a formal role and it comes with some responsibility. I don't want to put a downer on the conversation, but, you know, when can you incur personal liability?
So directors generally owe their duties to the company and they have to act in the best interest of their shareholders. But what they need to be aware of is particularly when there's a twilight insolvency situations, there's situations where the company could be going into insolvency. It's in that situation that they can get personal liability, or they could be personally liable for any decisions that they've made, particularly in relation to kind of company's finances. So as soon as anything smells a bit fishy, or you know it's approaching insolvency, I just say get advice as soon as possible. Make sure you know what you're doing, and if you don't, well, get advice to make sure that you're not taking on more responsibility than you should be.
Okay, so moving on to slightly more positive notes, what do you need to become a director? So starting, you know, perhaps over to you, Alex. What experience do you need? What do you bring to the table in your NED role?
Yeah, I think in this case, the story was that the company specifically addresses a pain point that I've seen more often than not in my career, where it's where there is a meeting the next day, the numbers are not yet available, the analysis would take a time, or the CFO in charge would have to provide data. So this is a problem that I understand. It is a management team that I found very, very strong, that I could very much relate to. And also through the work during the due diligence, we've obviously had the opportunity to build the knowledge of the competitive landscape of that business. So that is definitely very important, that we understand what we're dealing with, and that we can that we actually like dealing with the management team in charge. There should be a complementary skill set. So in my case, I see that I'm obviously coming from a corporate governance perspective, and I don't mind sometimes looking into those boring documents that are not always top of the list for a founder. That is not a specific comment for ScaleXP. This is just a general observation. And so on that aspect, especially in the early days when the NED, even if he or she is an investor director, is part of the team to some extent, I think it is important to bring something to the table and not just show up to the board meeting once a quarter, drink the coffee, eat the biscuits, and then go home.
I think that's absolutely right, especially with startups where we need to keep the boards small. So it's got to be someone who adds real value. It might not necessarily be on the corporate governance side if that's not your background, but it's something that the founders will benefit from. Ros, what would you say you're bringing to the table on your boards?
Well, I mean, on my boards, I'm specifically on them because of my telecoms knowledge, expertise, and network and knowledge of regulation, and those sorts of things as well. So and also just generally being a bit of a nerd, you know, quite interested in most of those things. So some of it's sector expertise, some of it is network, some of it is the ability to understand the problems and ask questions. You know, so for example, I have a little bit of manufacturing in my background, and that's helpful with some of these things. And I spend a lot of time in a specific sort of software development. So, you know, again, that's helpful for one of the other businesses because I understand the issues and I understand the market. I think you know, there are those sorts of things, but as well, there's a really key part of the board is this sort of interpersonal dynamic between the non-execs and between the execs and, you know, non-execs, whether your board is 4 people and whether it's an advisory board or a formal board, or you know, something in between. I really think those things are important. You don't, you know, as Alex was saying, you don't want a bunch of people who turn up and eat the biscuits, nod along, you know, and then go away again. You need to have some dynamic questioning. But equally, from my perspective, you know, I always, I used to be a school governor many moons ago, and they taught me this phrase about being a critical friend. And I've tried to always bring that. And I think the trick is always to try and remember the friend bit as well as the critical bit, because it's quite easy, you know, and having been on the CEO side, where I was also a director as well as the non-exec side, you know, you bring some papers, you bring, you know, whatever it is, and to just be criticized roundly for those constantly is not, it's not a useful, it doesn't build a particularly strong team. You know, it's not necessarily easy. So you need to find ways to manage all those sorts of issues, if you like, so you can actually work together on getting from, you know, whatever point you may be at as a startup where you may not yet have a really mature set of papers and those sorts of things, to getting to the point you feel you've got enough to, as a director and as, you know, normally quite often a shareholder in the business, feel you've got a handle on what's going on, where you're going, what the problems are, you know, and what the likelihood of you getting to, you know, whatever your goals happen to be for that, you know, year or 5 years or whatever are.
I've just seen a question.
Critical, sorry.
Oh, carry on, yep.
No, I just wanted to pick up on Ro's point of the critical friend, because it's obviously, especially at the stage where I'm operating, probably the first fundraise of the founder. So in my experience, it tends to be a traumatic experience to give up that control, to suddenly have board that you as a founder are responsible, have to answer to. So the investor director in that case, or to some extent a non-executive director that has been appointed by the investors, can appear as the personalization of that new challenge. So I think the critical friend is a key skill to be able to help to express to the company and to the founding team, yes, we're on your side, we want you to succeed, but at the same time making sure that the company stays on track, that everything is done properly, as May and Ross have discussed earlier, and at the same time handled in a friendly and productive way. So sorry, Sarah, I was interrupting, but I heard the critical friend, which I thought was a very, very poignant expression.
I've just seen a question on chat, which I thought would be good to ask at this point, and related to the critical friend issue. How do you avoid overstepping the mark, I suppose?
I think that's a really difficult one. And I would say some of that comes down to personal relationships. My bigger concern would be understepping the mark, to be perfectly honest with you, you know, and just allowing yourself to be told certain things, or getting, you know, because nobody else is saying something, you don't say something either. When you think that something's wrong, whether it's with numbers or with a dynamic or with a particular situation, and not being able to have those robust discussions is probably more of an issue. I mean, I think when you've overstepped the mark, in theory, at least, you should have a decent board chair who can help with that, and there will be times when you do, or somebody does. And I think, you know, again, it's a function of trying to make sure the board dynamics work well. And again, to me, this comes down to a really good chair is probably, I think, the best tool the board can have to actually manage or support the business, because they will help resolve any issues like that get sorted out. But you know, I'd argue that if somebody doesn't overstep the mark from time to time and push the exec a little bit too hard, you may not be doing your jobs. You know, conversely, the other's true, where the exec might push back on the board pretty hard, you know, for similar reasons.
and possibly board members pushing back on each other when they think they've overstepped the mark, because I think I mean, yeah, we discussed this quite a lot when we spoke previously about the human side of it and building trust between board members. So they should be kind of frank and open conversations, shouldn't they, with a high level of trust between people, not political. So I just want to move on to expectations of boards and NEDs, and how do these change depending on the size and stage of a business? And there's a note to ask you, Alex, about investor director consent.
Yeah, maybe then I kick off this point. The expectations obviously depends very much on the mandate. I'm appointed by the investors and I'm tolerated by the company to that extent, but that only works so far. So obviously, if this role becomes more disruptive than helpful, then it's in no one's interests. But I see the expectations to our board that we are a very good sounding board for the executive team, that if we have anything relevant, proactive, if we've got anything relevant that we can bring proactively to the table, that we should do so. So if we have a contact that is relevant to the company, let's do so. On the other hand, what I see as my role is making sure that everything runs smoothly and not getting into the way of the founders and their executive teams. So I think our board is successful if we have a founder that has been able to meet his or her objectives, that has been successfully communicated with the different stakeholders, but that has been able to meet the regulatory requirements. And with that, I also mean the accounts and all those different, in a smooth way without disrupting the business too much. So that is the target that we've set ourselves.
Excellent, thank you. Ros, do you want to comment on that? And also, I'd just be interested in hearing from you your perspective as previously an executive director. So you had a board that was supposedly meant to support you, and how did that go?
Well, obviously, I'm subject to lots of clauses, so I will keep it relatively short. I mean, what I would say is from an exec director perspective, and certainly from somebody who's, spent a huge amount of time and energy getting funding, and then, as Alex says, going through the slightly traumatic due diligence and funding process, where you think you've ironed everything out, and things, things should work in a particular way, then it's quite difficult in the sense that, people's perspective of certain things that you might think are common, like assuming that because you think you've got the same objectives, you would operate as a team automatically. I think actually trying to define those things, not formally in all the paperwork, but when you kick off at the beginning, is really useful to just help build, or at least help sort of put the foundations in place for how the relationships are expected to work by each member of the board, for example, because I do think expectations can be quite different. They're often based on, particularly with investors and those sorts of things, they're based on previous experience. And of course, nobody's or very few people's previous experiences will be the same. There's normally one or two sort of stronger characters, or if you like, people that other people would defer to, or that actually have more power in the paperwork. So from an exec perspective, I think that sort of thing is useful, and also openness around, what is happening that impacts a business or impacts actually the stakeholders in the business. Because, again, if you take last year's, the back end of last year, that terrible budget problem that has had problems that still echo today in terms of the cost of money and those sorts of things, for lots of people I know that were on boards or running businesses, that had a very, very strong effect for a number of months. And if you can't be clear and open about what the impact might be from either side on that, whether it's ongoing investment, whether it's, you know, from the exec team, the cost of operational money to just manage the business on a day-to-day basis, you know, if you can't have those frank and open conversations, and I think that's probably the biggest issue that you might have in terms of actually being able to support an executive team, right? Because realistically, everybody should be aiming for whatever you define the success of the business as, but there will be constraints. And if you can't understand your constraints, it's very hard to run a business.
Thank you. So I've just been informed that there's a problem with chat. So if anyone has a question, please put up your hand and I'll get round to you. But I just want to run through 2 or 3 other questions of mine, but then we'll be taking audience questions. So raise your hand, I will pass you the microphone. So I wanted to ask about, it's a question that often comes up, remuneration. Should you expect to be paid NED? Who wants to start off with that? Alex, why don't you talk about startup NEDs to begin?
Sure. Yes, I mean, in our case, we've just held the moment that the investor director steps on board is just after a fundraise where we've worked incredibly hard to bring angels on board, angels who are committing their personal money. So it's this money at the early stage, that may be pre-Series A, pre-Series B, is incredibly precious. So I think at this point to expect fixed compensation is not helpful, and so it's almost contradicting the spirit of what we're trying to achieve, where we're supporting the business in their growth, where we're ideally bringing our expertise and our network to bear. And therefore, in the early stages, I think it would be reasonable for the business to expect NEDs to be unpaid. I'm aware that some NEDs are paid from an early stage on, but this is not something that I would expect, and that I like to see in the businesses that I'm involved in.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you. So I suppose that sort of generally reflects the Angel Academy position that, you know, fees, yes, but once the company's in a much stronger position to pay them, so not in the early days.
Sometimes you see shares offered.
Yes, I was just going to say, yes, are there alternatives that, you know, alternative remunerations? So over to you, May.
Well, sometimes you do see share options granted, growth shares to kind of senior or particularly active chairs or those who are putting cash, but again, it's not something that should be expected at a startup level. It's only in kind of really particular circumstances, and it really depends on the person as well.
And then Ros, presumably, you know, if you're on the board of a listed company, you should expect to be paid.
Yes, one way or another. Yes, I mean, not every bigger or listed business actually pays cash. Some do all sorts of weird share schemes as well. It depends what country they're in. Some pay you and then assist you by, you know, the same amount of shares or something like that out the back end. There are a number of ways of doing it, but normally, yes, you'd absolutely expect to get paid, and it does come with some, I'd say, you know, the responsibilities that it comes with, and the potential liabilities, if you like, and the amount of work, for me, require it gets paid, because it is, you know, it's a lot. I mean,
opportunity cost, isn't it?
Yeah, I say that, but, you know, obviously I do a number of boards that I don't get paid for the government that are actually quite busy as well, and those sorts of things. So you know, I suppose to a degree, yes, it is opportunity cost, and a little bit, you know, there's a bit more risk involved as well for the individual, and it is, you know, it's not something you can just walk away from very easily, even if you should want to. You also have to get re-elected every year, but I would say, you know, for me, when I think about smaller businesses and those sorts of boards that I've been on before, certainly I've seen a number of situations where particularly very involved chairs get growth shares or something similar rather than cash. So the idea is, if the business achieves its aims and therefore all the investors end up happy, then the chair, effectively makes some money based on that.
Okay, you briefly touched on advisory roles in government boards, and there's also trustees and governorships of schools and charities, similar sort of positions, but they don't tend to attract salaries. Is that correct? May, perhaps you can kind of fill in there.
Yeah, again, it's not expected that they get salaries. It's only kind of when the company starts making money and they can pay directors more than like a pittance that they can start thinking about remunerating other people.
Okay, and then a little bit of technical detail for you again, May. When you're being appointed as an NED, there are some documents that you'll probably need to sign. What are they, and what's your sort of personal checklist of things that you should do?
Yeah, so you should, your kind of duties and what's expected of you should be set out in a letter of appointment. So if you don't get offered one, I'd ask one, just so that you're super clear on what your role is and what's expected of you. There might be confidentiality provisions within there, or you might get a separate NDA just to cover any information that you receive. I'd also make sure that you're covered by D&O insurance. So for any liability that you may incur in office, just make sure that's included. And you can often see in articles of association whether there's an indemnity insurance provision. So if the company's got model articles as kind of startups, early stage startups do, you'll be right at the end, just to make sure that the company's got you covered for anything that you might be taking liability on for.
And what's D&O insurance? Just what's that stand for? Directors
and officers insurance. So it's kind of compensation claims against business decisions made by office holders, so directors, company secretaries, things like that.
Okay, thank you. So we have got plenty of time for audience questions. Sarah Hope has very patiently had her hand up for quite a while, so I am just going to find her in the I can't now find her in the guest list, so no, her hand's down. Right, I have got a couple of questions on chat. So how do you get rid of an NED if you're a founder, for example, and you think you've appointed the wrong person? how can you get rid of them? How does that work? And have you been in that situation? Anyone?
If you do have a letter of appointment, it should also contain termination provisions. So that's quite useful to have. Again, one of the reasons why you'd ask for one. If you're kind of a founder, you want to make sure that you are appointing someone, but that they're performing their role. So in circumstances where they're not performing their role, then you'd want to get rid of them and make sure that they're not kind of sitting there doing nothing.
And is that does that tend to be kind of put to a vote, or is it the founders or the executives' choice?
Yeah, it can depend. You can have whatever termination provisions you want. So, for example, you can have, if you commit a breach of your obligations, or things like fraud or dishonesty, things like that, with normally automatic termination. It could be up to the board. So it's kind of flexible that way.
Okay, all right. And Alex, Ros, have you had any experience of people being removed from the board? And
no, not at this stage. So, and it's also overall the structure of the board in the case of the investor director being ultimately answerable to the investors. So the process for the investor director is to some extent outside the immediate investment agreement. So that is more the investors believing that their director is not fulfilling his or her duties. So at some extent, we've obviously gone through the details, what would be required, but there is the question of how long the term of this director is, and if it is necessary to trigger the processes that May was talking about. But at this point, we haven't had that experience.
I mean, quite often, as Alex just said, there is a term to most, not quite a lot of directorships where you'd be expected to formally step down, then need to be renominated. If you're allowed to, not on all boards is it allowed that you would keep the same directors for more than, let's say, 4 years. In my experience as well, most people one way or another resign from boards. The one thing I would say is, again, when you look at your appointment letter or any other documents you might have or might have signed, it's really worth looking at what any post-termination clauses or restrictions may be. So, for example, are you still allowed to hold shares if you've been terminated as a member of the board? Are you allowed to work for any businesses in the same sector in a certain period of time, or even while you're holding shares? And, those sorts of questions all are things that you need to consider before you take up the position.
Right. Okay. We have now, I found Sarah Hope, who's been waiting patiently to ask a question. So I am just, you have the microphone, Sarah.
Hi there. Thanks very much. Roz and Alex actually both answered as part of my question around remuneration of a non-exec, kind of at the startup level. But taking that a step further, if you're, getting your hands dirty and you're working with a startup and you say bring in financing for them through your own personal or professional connections, is it reasonable to expect either some form of additional payment around that or a portion of, the financing amount as remuneration for kind of going above and beyond just sitting as a board member? Or is that, you're being remunerated perhaps in shares and a small amount of cash that just benefits the company and therefore you're ultimately paid on the back end? Is there a line there? And then is also there a conflict of interest? Thank you.
I have seen situations like that before, but what has normally happened in those situations, particularly in the finance raising situation, is that before the person, when they're a non-exec or otherwise, has gone out, to raise that money, is that a conversation's been had, which says, I am going to introduce you to, I don't know, BlackRock or whomever, and what I would like from that is a whatever fee should you get to this sort of point, and you need to agree that in advance. I mean, that's the if you like the most easy, straightforward, honest way to do it. Other ways of doing it all gets a little bit murky if you get halfway through the process and somebody turns around and goes, great, now I'd like some money for that introduction that I thought was in good faith. So I think it's probably worth setting those things out in advance. There's certainly some directors' appointments and allow, in fact most of the ones that I've seen allow for you to provide additional services. So if you, for example, if I know Alex was going to provide governance consulting services to make sure that they were, in compliance with all the new regulations that are coming in at the beginning of next year, then in theory he could, make an arrangement, charge a day rate for that as a contractor, as long as it's clear, it's above board, and it's not, it's not way above market rate or those sorts of things. There's no reason, unless May tells me that has changed significantly in the last couple of years, there's no reason directors can't do other work as well as, if you like, the non-exec work.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen commission arrangements for something very similar. I think you just need to be careful with your role as a director, though. You're kind of getting commission, so always get legal advice.
Yeah, I would also say, echo very much what Roz and May were saying. It's a tricky one. It's a very tricky one, to the extent that where does your role as an NED stop and your role as an advisor start? So ideally, if that is an involvement that you can see before, I think it's almost a point to consider before you accept the NED role, to keep it simpler and avoid disruption to the board, because it cannot always be clear that your discussions are for the advisory role that you're fulfilling and or your NED duties. So on that point, I'd be very specific what the advisory role is that you bring to the table, but I ideally avoid it. It's the last part is my instinct. The rest I'm pretty firm about.
That's great. Thank you so much. That answers the question.
Well, thanks for the question, Sarah. Now, Chiara, you've got a question. You should be able to speak to us.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. My question is, how do you balance being both an investor and, in this example, maybe where you have a reasonable equity stake in the business, and being an investor director at the same time, and maybe just using the example whereby maybe the company's a bit behind business plan, and that's a little bit of conflicting. How do you guys have any experience of that, and how you balance those two roles?
Yeah, I think that's probably a question I should answer. Well, it becomes a lot easier in the startup setting because there's not really a way to act on any information that I see to my personal benefit. It's not as if I can sell the shares or buy more, or so it's a lot simpler from the temptation point of view than in a publicly listed company where you could encourage people to buy or sell. And also my role is to encourage the executive team to be as transparent as possible to the investors, which is obviously more fun when you're on track or ahead of expectations. It's not as much fun when, for whatever reasons, things have gotten awry, which invariably those mishaps happen in pretty much every startup I've ever involved in that has happened. So the conflict is pretty much similar than in a bank, which are handling that situation that you're not allowed to deal on the proprietary information that you get, which again is not an option in this case, and that when there is an investment choice coming along that is available to the public, i.e. to the other investors, that the information is true and fair that is provided in the data room to potential investors and made available during the due diligence.
Okay, anything to add on that point, or should we move on to Linda's question? Linda, you're live now.
Hi, I wanted to ask the panel if they could outline what they would see as the difference between a non-exec and a chairman's role, and also perhaps talk a little bit about how, as a non-exec, you can prepare for that transition.
Shall I have a go at that? So, I mean, a chair is often a non-exec. The listed business I'm on actually has an executive chair, which is a slightly different and more interesting position. From a personal perspective, I'd say largely I think the more neutral, if you like, the chair, the better. So generally you kind of want them to be a non-exec, and that is actually, I would say, tradition and practice, if you like, as well. I genuinely couldn't tell you how to prepare for it. I was very lucky in my last business. I had an amazing chair who, probably doubled up as my therapist sometimes, bless him, but was excellent at managing the meetings, balancing the personalities, and also making sure that we were covering off all the things we needed to legally. I would say from a preparation perspective, probably one of the key things would be from a regulatory perspective, ensure you understand what you need to worry about. So when May was talking earlier about the sort of twilight zone pre-insolvency, you need to know when you're skating anywhere near those sorts of things and when you need to bring it back, when you need to bring in advice or advisors of some sort, and when there is information that actually you need to be careful about where it's shared, when it's shared, and those sorts of things. But I'm afraid I'm quite limited on my understanding of quite how much preparation it would take to chair a serious company board, if you like. All my chairing has been of advisory type boards so far.
Does that help, Linda?
Yes, I mean, I'm on a similar board to Alex. It's more of a startup, so it was more that type of smaller company. I was wondering about how it might look different.
Do you have a chair at Scale XP, Alex, or?
Chair is the founder in this case. So but as Ross was saying, I would expect the chair to be the moderator of the situation, and the board is obviously in this case still so small that there's no, let's say, formal moderation still required, because the lines of communication are so short. And what I would look for in a chair is someone who's got the ability to stay above the noise of the month to month, quarter to quarter, but to actually have the 30,000 foot analysis and actually be able to accept the tempers for what they are, and be able to moderate a compromise. But Linda, at this point, this is my understanding, and I would be lying if I said that this is from decades of first-hand experience.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. So, Imali, you had a question.
I did indeed. And thanks, everyone. Really, really interesting discussion. Continuing on actually from the chair conversation, but this might sort of extend into other NEDs as well, which is how much should a board chair, and I guess this is from both your experience, but also from what you've witnessed, how much should they be engaging with the investors in that company? And I guess, what part of that investor relations sort of balance do you think that they should be playing versus the executives?
I mean, Amalia, are you talking about I think there's a really big difference between, let's say, a listed business or a big private business and a startup on that. And, because
I would say a scaling company, shall we say, sort of Series A-ish. So you've probably got maybe a few angels in there, a couple of sort of VCs.
I mean, Alex, do you want to go first, and I'll add anything I've seen from. Sure.
I mean, the temptation is obviously to go ahead and become the spokesperson for the company, but frankly, that is not my role specifically. So I think no one can tell the investors better about the business than the people on the front line who actually have the conversation with the clients, who've got the feel for the information. Where I come in investor communication is, first of all, I make sure that it happens, which doesn't sound like much, but in a founder who is 150% preoccupied with other issues, writing that newsletter can be quite a challenge. So, and the other thing is obviously from our perspective to have an informal feel for what the questions out there are, what people think of the way that they're being communicated to, and also taking those points on board. That doesn't mean that I then see myself as a spokesperson, but I see myself as the person who brings it back to the company and make sure that those points are being addressed, because we are the people who have to remind the founders to some extent that there will be another fundraising round. They're by nature optimists. So having to think that at some stage the cash will run out and that they will need more is something that for them is in my experience often is an afterthought. So keeping those proverbial feet to the fire by communicating with investors, making sure that they are on board when the cash call comes around is, I think, an important role. And I think that's the biggest contribution that we can do.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that as well. Some of the more mature businesses we've seen at Angel Academy, and some of the businesses I've seen myself that have chairs, you know, talking to the chair is really interesting. And from an investor perspective, I've certainly always found it really helpful. And often, you know, quite enjoyable because you get a slightly different perspective than you do from a founder. It's less intimate, I suppose, but, you know, more focused quite often on being a shareholder in the longer range term of the business. And certainly that has been very useful. Are they front and center? Absolutely not driving it, no, but I haven't. And particularly where there have been VC funds or family offices engaged in those sorts of things, they do seem to like to see a slightly more mature board with a chair that they feel they can trust, that can steer things in a particular way.
Right, we now have lots of hands up. Sorry, May, carry on.
No, I was just going to echo what's been said. I mean, keeping an open line of communication is really key, especially for startups as well, because reaching out and keeping your investors updated, and even just asking for help. There might be something that you're looking to do, some next point of strategy or some big growth plan that you might need help with, that your investors, there could be someone among your investors that could provide that help. So keeping an open line of communication can be beneficial.
I think that's exactly right. We expect to hear from the founders for a good long while after we've invested. Jodie, would you like to ask your question? And then we've got one from Mia, but we'll have to draw a line after that. I'm very conscious of time. So Jodie, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. Thanks for the panel discussion. It's been fantastic. My question, look, I don't know if I've been watching too much Succession, but when you get the board papers before the board meeting, and you might see that there are some decisions to be made, or you might see that there are some problems that need to be discussed at the meeting. How likely are you to have a chat with some of the other board members before the meeting and, you know, just suss out their positions and work out some alliances, that kind of thing?
That all sounds very dramatic, Jodie. Sadly, I don't have Sky, so I've only seen the first season of Succession. But quite often, certainly when, and again, I mean, this might be less useful, but from my perspective, certainly when I put board papers together, largely I don't put anything together where there's something a bit worrying without telling normally board members that it is coming. And quite often having signalled those things in advance, even if it's just over email. From the perspective of receiving them, quite often I will reach out to other non-execs, and actually quite often the chair or the CEO, to say, you know, I see you've put this in, I think it's missing this information, or I don't quite understand, or, you know, have you got a solution in mind that you just haven't written down, you know, whatever it happens to be. Because again, I kind of don't want to go in there blind to a degree, not knowing what's going to happen, and also ending up in a position where, you know, there's a solution that somebody's already started working on. Because when they write the board paper, when I write board papers, right, it's kind of like a processing facility anyway, I think, from an executive perspective. And you kind of, it helps you think, certainly for me, it helps me think, it helps me reflect. And so I feel like by the time the board then comes around, let's say a week or 2 weeks later, probably wheels are going to be in motion as well. So again, if you have any particularly strong thoughts, or you're very keen to make sure the board is making a decision on something, and that, you know, it hasn't just sort of the train hasn't slid out of the station quietly anyway, then from my perspective, you know, that always requires a little bit of coordination. And in my experience with non-execs, you'll have a senior, but most of the time, you know, we all reach out to each other quite comfortably.
Mm-hmm. Great. Good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a temperature check. So it's not necessarily alliances or the like. So it's obviously when you find something in the board paper that you don't immediately understand, or that stands out as an odd point, we're small enough that the lines of communication are short enough that we can actually just pick up the phone and speak to each other, and avoid making it a big discussion during the meeting itself. That doesn't really have the flavor of the alliances. In my case, is obviously because the board observer is another investor. There is understanding what the interpretation of the current situation of the company is like, and so that going into the meeting, we know what everybody's priorities are, whether we are in for a reasonably straightforward meeting where we can just approve the numbers and talk about the next quarter, ideally the next year, or whether we have to go back to the existing numbers. But on the side, as a quick comment on succession, in my previous life, I was an activist investor, and I was amazed just by how realistic a lot of the interactions in successions were. So they've really done their research.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I like that. The temperature check. That's probably a better way to put it. So yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Mia, your question, please. Thank you for waiting.
No worries. Reiterating my thanks to the group for a very interesting session. My question is a bit more on kind of the personal journey front when you're thinking about participating in boards and different types of them. So, for example, I tend to find, I've worked with early stage founders for some time, being on their advisory board or ultimately their first board can come quite naturally when I've worked very closely with them. But on kind of more mature companies from a NED perspective, in your experience, have you run those in parallel, or have you found that there's much crossover? I've actually found those to be very different spaces. So if people are looking to develop kind of a more diversified experience from a board participation perspective, would you suggest kind of engaging in those in different ways, or searching for those positions in different parallel tracks? And then I guess the second half of that question is, how many do you think is too many? Because I also see some people that are on so many boards, and it feels like that's hard to take your duties as a board member in a very hands-on approach. But on the flip side of that, some people have quite unique expertise that they're trying to offer. So would love your thoughts on kind of those two elements of building your own board resume.
Shall I go? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I do quite a lot of different things. So I do these government boards and things as well, which vary in the amount of time they take. And the other thing I would say is, in my experience, businesses have different rhythms. So September's always a bit of a nightmare. December and July and August tend to be really quiet. Often March, April, May is horrendously busy as well. Depending on where various cycles are in different industries. But I don't know that there's a right answer, really. I mean, there is an issue where, again, from the listed and, from a voting perspective, with funds, particularly if they consider you to be overboarded, which always makes me think about that film. But, as in you're on too many boards, then often you will get a number of votes against you from the voting services. And being overboarded, I think, is a genuine concern, but largely from my knowledge and experience, most of the thing is, can you do the work that's required of you and deliver actual value to the business? Because the key thing is that you need to be delivering, like you said, Maya, with particular expertise. You need to be delivering value for the shareholders and for the people that work in the business and the communities around the business, and those sorts of things. And that's probably the most important consideration from the perspective of servicing them, and then whether or not actually, whether or not it rings your bell as well, I guess. Alex, do you have anything to add with your?
Yeah, it's all about your capacity and your level of involvement. And Ross, as you said, it's these things just seem to happen all at the same time. That sometimes in July. There are moments when you're like, when is the phone going to ring? And it doesn't. And then suddenly in September, everybody comes back and everybody has the big projects that they want to address, or the big questions that need to be solved. So on that level, and Ross, you mentioned the voting services. I've seen the advisors actively send these directors and the non-execs and the chairmen were on too many boards. Unfortunately, I wouldn't have a precise number in mind. I would think 3 is probably a sweet spot. From my gut feeling, 5 is where it becomes too many. But it really depends on the involvement and also how mature the company is.
And is there any legislation around this, May?
Not really. And pretty much anyone can be a director. Yeah, I just echo what Alex was saying. It's just down to capacity, what your role is, whether you can fulfill that role, and whether you're kind of comfortable doing so.
Okay, right. I'm very conscious that we've run over time, so I think we're going to have to call it a day there. I've got one more slide, which just has some next steps for people. Simon is going to just bring that up. Thank you. So I just want to thank our wonderful speakers for their contribution. I think we could have left the conversation going a bit longer, but thank you very much. Perhaps we'll do another on this subject. It seems to be a very popular one. Next slide. Okay, so if there are any founders on the line that would like to pitch to our investors, please apply to pitch via our website. Michelle is the person to contact if you're an angel investor or want to be an angel investor and get involved. And please do follow us on LinkedIn. We have a monthly newsletter on Substack, so please sign up there. And recordings of our previous webinars are already on the YouTube channel, and this one will be in the next few days. So if you want to recap on anything, you will find it there. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you again for the speakers. Thank you for the great questions, and enjoy the rest of your evening.